Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Future of London Learning from Crisis Roundtable on Paying for Public Projects. I'm Lisa Taylor. I'll be your moderator today, and I'm Executive Director at Future of London and Director at Coherent Cities. If you don't know it already, the Learning from Crisis series is really true to Future of London's USP in that it's about ideas from across all kinds of sectors and organizations. It's about connection. And it's also about diversity in terms of representation and ideas. We think those are important. Finally, one of the things that we think is important that you'll know about us if you know Future of London is that we're about, I guess, next wave or next generation leadership. So you're hearing today from quite senior known people, some people you may not know so well. We're trying to bring new people to the fore, and we encourage you to get involved with us in that way. So far, Learning from Crisis has touched on a lot of topics. One of the things about COVID is it allows you to go a bit broader. We're looking at economic fallout, culture, housing, well-being, social connection, all the aspects of it. And we've also been able to start a podcast called City Bites. We run webinars and we have YouTube videos that you can watch. A ton of resources on the website as well. So we encourage you to take advantage of that. If you're tweeting today, our handle is @futureofldn, and the hashtag is #learningfromcrisis. And if you capitalize learning and then from and then crisis, readers can pick that up better. Just a general sort of thing, thinking about people who may have disabilities, that will help them out a lot. This particular session on paying for public projects started live in rooms with people. I will refer to rooms a couple of times. And it was held last year in autumn and winter of 2019-20, backed by Montague Evans, who's supporting this event and lending us head of planning, Craig Blatchford. Thanks to them. It was also supported at the time by Lewis Silkin and Poly Group. And it was thinking about issues like Brexit, what was coming at us, but also thinking about some of the emerging types of funding that were coming, ESG, sort of the environmental social governance funding, anything from that to outliers like Bitcoin, and trying to help people who are already short-staffed with just the complications of where do you get funding? What do you need to think about? Obviously now things are changing even further. We were calling this originally post-COVID, but it's also pre-planning reform and pre-Brexit. So it's kind of about funding public projects in a chaotic time. Obviously, the news is inescapable. We've seen that Crossrail 2 is shelved, Bakerloo Line Extension is shelved, TfL has huge operational budget issues going on. Last week, Croydon declared they were going to do a Section 114 for super strict budget control. This week, we just heard that the mayor's budget for next year, 20 and 21 or 21-22 is cut by 38 million. So I looked at the attendance list. It's great to see all of you, but I'm assuming that everybody on this call is being affected by this personally in some way and professionally in terms of what you're able to do and how you're able to plan. So we're hoping that today's speakers can help you. Some of them actually have funding, which is very rare. Please don't ask them for money on screen. You know, that's a whole other phone call. But they all have insight to share, and they've got experiences they can share with you as well. So take advantage of that. As always, after this on the website, there'll be an event page that has a write-up. It'll have full bios for everyone if you want to find out more about them with links, and it'll have some sort of signposting for places you can go for help. So this is one part of the whole piece. I think we've got nearly a full house at this point. So what we'll do is each speaker will go for about 5 minutes on, I guess the framing question is really, what have you seen happen, but how can people make these public projects happen within their sphere of experience? I'm going to start with Tony Travers from LSE. I think perhaps looking at that framework of central and council relationships, it's been very fraught. What's happening there and what might we be expecting, or what can people do? Tony, over to you.
Mute myself. Thanks very much, and good morning, everybody. Thanks to Future for London for inviting me to take part today. And I'll just say a few words by way of introducing the subject. The most obvious thing to start with is that cities rely on infrastructure. The bigger the city, the more it relies on projects to build infrastructure, be it railways or housing or roads or whatever it is. They just need physical kit in a way that more rural areas don't. That's just an obvious statement of the obvious. And it's also, I think, worth remembering that after previous crises, and everybody quotes Franklin Delano Roosevelt here, FDR, and the investments that were made in the United States after the Depression in the 20s and 30s. And indeed, we had our New Works program in London, actually, in the 1930s, that after an event of the kind represented by COVID-19, and there are very few things like it, or even after 1945, investment by government is a sort of Keynesian way of pushing against the economic detriment that undoubtedly this event will have caused. And this is not only true of London. If we've got obviously visitors from Greater Manchester and elsewhere on board, I'd argue this is true for all the large cities of the UK. And as Lisa suggests, that London, well, has been the beneficiary of substantial investment in recent years. The Underground, the Olympics, lots of private development, lots of housing development. My housing associations have radically improved. I always think, especially with housing, it's always possible to imagine everything's getting worse all the time. But actually, if you compare London with what it was like 20 or 30 years ago, or indeed the centre of many other British cities, they are infinitely better than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So we have had investment, and I think to the sense, almost to the point in London, that there's some pushback from the rest of the country because they think London has perhaps had too much investment. I don't think it has, but I do think we can all support other cities in the UK in catching up to get towards the level of infrastructure that London has. And I think that shouldn't be a zero-sum game. Now, as Lisa suggests, central government in Britain is very powerful. The UK is England within the UK is a very centralized country, and therefore central government controls taxation, or most of it. Even local taxation is capped, and also has limits on borrowing. And you only have to look at the predicament of Transport for London, which through no fault of its own has lost a large chunk of its passengers and revenues. And the difficulty of getting the bailout from central government to keep services going. What that tells us is dependency is not great, that the more a council or TfL or other body is dependent on central government, of course they need help when bad times like this come along, but separately it allows the centre to exert its power, which is not necessarily a good thing. Just briefly looking forward, a lot of council resourcing, or the potential for growing the resource base, had in recent years come from a number of sources: development, but also from growth in business rates and the potential to capture part of the growth in business rates. This was true in a number of London authorities and indeed for London as a whole. Truth is, business rates are not going to return to anything like normal with their normal yield for some time to come. And indeed, the whole future of business rates seems to me to be potentially under threat, both as an income source to central and local government, but also how it works and how it affects businesses, because at some point the business rate reliefs that are now in place, particularly for retail and leisure businesses, are going to be, business rates will be restored, and that will not necessarily be good for city centres when that happens. And then just coming to the end of what I'm going to say, the impact on central London and downtowns more generally, so the centre of Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds and other cities in Britain, has been profound. And I think there's a risk if we can't, I mean, there are benefits, of course, to some outer parts of cities who may have higher footfall in their shops, more spending in restaurants and so on. But in the end, a functioning city centre is important as a shop window for the city, for the rest of the world, to the rest of the world. And I do think there's a slight risk that in all the gung-ho optimism for, well, everybody can move out and get a better life and work from home, there's a risk of that of sprawl, and Britain can't afford urban sprawl. We need tightly packed, dense and well-planned cities across the country, and certainly in London. So my final thought is this: COVID-19, and indeed its sort of cousin Brexit, are themselves massive massive hit to Britain. Whatever you think about Brexit, it's going to change this. So I think this is a moment for a reset, and that for government, both at the national, subnational and local level, city, regional and local level, we need to reset in a way, not just to sloganize to deliver better, but actually to think about exactly what kind of city we want and then deliver it. That's it.
Thanks, Tony. Really good start for all of us, I think. What do we want and delivering it? I'm going to go to Peter Matthew at Hounslow next, perhaps a bit of a different opinion on the CAS versus the outer cities, but you're doing a bit of a reset now. What are you doing in Hounslow? You've been really hard hit by Heathrow, haven't you? You can come off mute.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have been extremely hard hit in Hounslow. So there's a bit of a double whammy in Hounslow. We've been hit by COVID, but then we also have to think about the hit from Heathrow, given our proximity to Heathrow. So effectively, what we are looking at in Hounslow is an economy that we believe will shrink by between 15 and 20% over the next 2 years. We've already seen about 8,000 to 9,000 job losses. And 40% of working age people in Hounslow are currently either unemployed or furloughed. So, and I can go on, but it's a significant hit on the borough. I think the question for us then was actually, well, what should be our response to all of this? And I think the first thing we did was to actually commission some very quick analysis to understand the nature of the impact. And through a series of work by Oxford Economics and other consultancies, we got a very clear picture of what is happening to which communities. I think to take the global numbers of one thing is to understand the disaggregation of these numbers, that we would be able to understand how best to frame our recovery. And so I think it's the first point I will make in terms of actually, well, there is an interesting question about funding, but I think the first order question for us was actually, what should be our priority for funding? And I think out of this huge amount of analysis we've done over the summer, we have prepared a recovery plan. And the recovery plan is important because it actually does define our priorities going forward. And that is around clarity about how do we actually invest in renewing our local economies? How do we invest in tackling local inequalities as a result of everything else? How do we support local residents? And to pick up on Tony's point, how do we reimagine our local places, and in particular our town centres and our high streets? So I think there is that clarity for us that we have a good sense of where investment is best needed. And I think that's our starting point. Looking at this in more granular detail, a strand of this was then to look at what should be the economic recovery focus for the borough. And given where we are, I think we have always been ambitious in terms of regeneration. And so there was a clarity that said, well, in terms of framing the investment, we need to look at how we can actually continue and stimulate the housing growth and development and the construction industry, as well as the role of the council in investing in that regeneration, investing in housing growth as a catalyst for actually overall economic growth and going forward. So we've looked at that, and we've actually come out with a number of initiatives. But I think before I touch on that, I think the second thing I will say, and especially from a council perspective, is make sure you've got a very prudent and pragmatic finance director in your back pocket. And I think in Hounslow, we do have that. And I think that is critically important because, yes, we want to be ambitious. Yes, we want to invest, but doing so wisely is something I think is crucial to all of this. And I think we've got a finance team who are actually supportive of that. But that ties into the fact that we were able to give them the clarity of a recovery plan that explains what we want to do, why and how. So just to quickly wrap up on this, I think what we've then ended up, and there are many routes that we can take to seek investments, and I can't speak for all of the areas we're doing, but if you take two things I'll mention, one of the things we realize is actually in terms of investment, it's about actually how do we, first of all, given the objectives we're trying to achieve, how do we retain spend within the borough? So we have launched a Keep It Local campaign, and that is about how do we maximize keeping the Hounslow pound in Hounslow. And it sounds simple, but in doing that, we have started off by rethinking our local procurements. And so we have done that, and to the point where we have got a framework in place where we can support local businesses through the council's own spending activities. And that's crucial because councils spend billions of pounds every year. And do we actually channel that for most impact into local community is something that we have actually looked to do. The second thing which follows from that is then look at our big spending areas. And quite clearly, we are still spending heavily on capital programs. And that breaks up into two parts. We do have a council house building program. And at this stage, the council was ambitious enough to say, accelerate that program, accelerate it now. It is absolutely needed. And it's then a question of actually making best use of the funding currently available to the council and make it available quickly. And we do have funding sources because we do have a reasonably healthy HRA, Housing Revenue Account. We do have Section 106s, we do have recycle right to buy receipts, and we do have the GLA subsidies. So there is a pot of funding here. And I think the question for us is how do we make maximum use of that at this time? Coupled with that, there
Peter?
are... Hello?
Peter, just checking. I think we need to kind of keep going. So we'll come back to some of the detail perhaps when we go to questions, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine. So I think my basic point is actually be prudent in how you spend, but have a framework to guide your spend.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Beck, related to what's going on, Peter mentioned investment. There's council investment as well. This will apply to a lot of you. But when we spoke on the phone, you talked about investors needed to educate themselves about what's changing now, not perhaps being used to what's coming at you. What are you seeing, and what should people be thinking in terms of investors, in terms of people trying to draw funding from them?
Yeah, I think probably the first thing we're seeing, both kind of public sector investment and private sector investment, is entirely understandable, which is a bit of a paralysis of decision making in many places, and everyone can kind of get that. But I think the challenge with it is after a time that starts to have really hard impact in terms of projects being delayed and people losing confidence on the fact that decisions will be made. So challenge number one is really trying to work through where decisions can be made. Can we all collectively make them to push on? Because that in itself is confidence building, and obviously talks to jobs, growth, and all the things that I think will come out in this discussion. Momentum is pretty key to ultimately getting outcomes. The other area that I think we're seeing quite a lot of is the trends that you'd seen maybe in the built environment and kind of places where retail was been struggling for quite a while. So that's not new, that retail is now pretty dire place and struggling very much. Workplace office has seen a massive shift with the COVID position, but I think the big question there is no one knows what will happen, and so people are very nervous around, will it be okay, will it not be okay? And Tony's point, what is the future of the city centre? And all of those things combined mean that actually there is a lot of interest in residential and a focus there, but we have investors who in many parts might have been traditionally quite focused on single assets and equipped themselves for that. And suddenly, I think many people are understanding much more around, we need to think of a mixed use strategy, but they haven't necessarily got the experience and also probably the confidence, because that comes with experience, to kind of push forwards on that and support that. So I think from a Lendlease perspective, from a placemaker, a lot of work around educating all sorts of investors and stakeholders around how that can work successfully. And collectively, I think that world needs to do more of that. But also, I think there will just simply be a time scale that has to happen until people feel confident to start making decisions. And those two things combined can hopefully start to move us all forwards. The other real positive that does come out of this, once that kind of change curve piece happens, is I think we're seeing a lot of people suddenly, from an investment perspective, realise that they've wanted to do investments that are very much aligned with social and economic outcomes and environmental outcomes. And that's been a big driver, and you've seen massive change in that in the last 2-3 years. I think some of the other speakers will talk around that. And suddenly seeing that actually when they put things together in baskets from a mixed use investment perspective, actually they're investing in communities, and that's delivering exactly what they want in terms of financial returns, and aligning with social and environmental outcomes. So I'm quite hopeful that when we get through that big change curve, a lot of positivity will come out of it, but I think it's just a tough ride now.
Thanks, Beck. Really good point about the education of investors. And Pete and Gemma were both nodding madly. I'm coming to Pete next anyway. You guys have in-house research and so forth. You're investing all over the country right now. How are you doing it, and what advice can you have for other investors and for councils looking for funding?
Thanks, Lisa. So I think really briefly, the first thing to say is that the investment has actually, within L&G, has actually grown during lockdown. People are still, by no means all people, and obviously it's been pretty horrendous, the impact on some people's livelihoods, but others are still paying into their pensions, still paying into their savings. The amount of money L&G stewards has gone up from 1,000 billion to 1,200 billion during the period of lockdown. So the amount of capital within places like L&G, and you know, the likes of Aviva, M&G would have a similar story, I'm sure, is actually growing. And it's that pool of money we as a society need to be tapping up it, because the fundamental point for me in all of this is our wealth at the moment is not measured in how many trillion we have, but in the way that we step up to contribute to society, and to actually step up to address some of the needs for investment that previous speakers have outlined at the moment. And so, you know, for us, that's been, again, during lockdown, we've announced mixed use investments into Sheffield, into Sunderland in lockdown, because I've been busier than I've ever been with places on the phone, on Skype, on Zoom, on Teams, saying, we have got this vision for recovery. You know, the government can give us a grant for 30 million, but we need 300 million. So where's the other 270 coming from? And that is the fantastic opportunity for those of us who steward society's money at the moment to step up and have the impact and bring that investment drive, inclusive growth that comes out the other side of this. It's inclusive growth. I think the other thing that a couple of speakers have already alluded to, but our CEO was on a call with Boris about only last night, is green growth. And for me, the really exciting area is that a lot of the things that government are talking about, and again, in lockdown, I spent 6 months looking at residential retrofitting, for example. A lot of these areas of investment actually generate savings that we can use to pay pensions with. So it's not as if we look across the country and just think, geez, like the whole country's a mess, there's nothing to invest into, we're all up the creek without a paddle. The UK still has huge strengths in the knowledge economy. You know, we've got unbelievable universities that are the envy of the world. There's huge expertise in green. And a lot of these things actually have that virtuous circle of, you know, the previous speakers have mentioned, where if we invest for the long term, and it's not going to be a short-term thing in 3 years, but it's going to be over the next 10, 20 years, we can invest to drive growth, drive employment, and actually things that improve the environment socially and environmentally as well. So I'm upbeat. I genuinely think there's all to play for at the moment, and it's going to require all of us having that shared sense of humanity that we need to work together more than ever. But there's a real opportunity for us to do that as a society now, and you know, as we say, come out this better than we went in.
Thanks, Pete. Really useful points and helpful, and it links very nicely into Gemma, who's with Big Society Capital. Same thing. Does that resonate for you, what Pete said? What are you seeing in your work, and what should people be looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, everyone. So at Big Society Capital, we're a little bit a different scale to L&G. Don't quite have the same amount to invest personally, but we do work really hard to catalyse the ecosystem for investment and to bring in others alongside us to help give a bit of insight into what we do as a social investor. I'll share a bit of what we got up to in the, I guess, the first wave of the crisis, and then what we're seeing now going forward. So when the crisis first kicked off, we really focused hard our work in 3 areas. One was sharing information. So we gathered information on the latest funding, relief funding, different grant pots and things are being made available, COVID guidelines, to where to find PPE, and publish weekly blogs and a centralised hub space, particularly aimed at communities and also social enterprises and charities. The other thing as a social investor that we did, we had one critical job to do as well, which was to review and adapt all of our existing funding. So we have 97 funds, and there's $1 billion of capital in those with our co-investors. and our investment teams and our fund managers were working furiously hard to provide forbearance wherever possible. So to date, we've provided a mix of amended terms, capital and or interest payment holidays to more than 500 organisations that needed it. And then the other third thing that we were really focusing on was what was our role in terms of the emergency response. So we developed a couple of new funding streams, again, particularly for either local communities or social economy in those areas. One was the Resilience and Recovery Loan Fund. That was with our partner at Social Investment Business. This is a £25 million fund that uses the CBILS scheme to provide emergency loans to that sector. And I mean, it was a mammoth team effort, working with DCMS, the British Business Bank, and we had it up and running within weeks. Something like that usually takes months, if not a good couple of years to pull together when we got that much collaboration involved. Another thing that we're working on, again, that's been highlighted through this really is the Everyone In initiative with government. So we're looking to support local authorities and charities find the properties they need to support the 15,000 homeless people that were temporarily living in hotel accommodation during the first lockdown. So our focus was really in those three areas. In terms of what I saw particularly, or we saw in the funding landscape, we did see, perhaps a little bit conversely to what we're just hearing about LNG, but we did see a slight pause in the development or fundraising for new propositions. And that was a lot of the time because investors like us were focused on supporting our existing portfolios in the best way that we could, or indeed pivoting spare liquidity to provide emergency response. We're now, and I am definitely seeing in my portfolio signs that this is lifting, but it's definitely more a focus on impact than ever before. I think one thing that COVID has definitely done has amplify the inequality in the UK. I think more people are waking up to the fact that finance has a big role to play in that. So yeah, I too am pretty optimistic about once we've got over the change curve of what this looks like in terms of what capital can do to really change the lives of people in the UK. We've already seen social investment grow since 2011. We do a piece of market sizing work each year, and that's telling us from kind of humble beginnings of 830 million a year in 2011, in 2019, it was valued at 5.1 billion, which is absolutely huge. And that's social impact across a number of different tools, from venture capital funds, social banks, charity bonds, specialist lenders, social property funds in particular. They didn't really exist 8 years ago, but at the minute they're accounting for like almost 42% of the overall market. So I think the future is bright. I think the future will be more focused on impact. There is obviously a lot of pain and challenge to get through in the meantime.
Thanks, Gemma. I think that ties really naturally to Maria's work at the Foundation for Future London, which is sort of I guess, a catalyst organization, if you like, for the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park and everything that's happening there in terms of development, arts and support. We talked about, I guess, flexing the message a bit. Maria, let us know what you're doing and what you would recommend.
Well, what we would recommend, I mean, the Foundation for Future London is focusing on people and place and local economy. And the way we do that is continuing to fund, providing grants with our partners, Westfield Stratford City and City of London, and also having consistent conversations with potential prospects, philanthropic prospects. I mean, for us, for the Foundation for Future London, we're very much around ensuring that East Bank, which, as most people know, is the new cultural quarter in East London, it's at the heart of four amazing boroughs, which is Waltham Forest, Hackney, Tower Hamlets and Newham. And as other colleagues have said, a lot of communities are actually really suffering from these impacts, and some of our boroughs are as well. And so for the Foundation, it's absolutely crucial that we continue to focus on our commitment to create jobs, up to 2,500, hopefully more, and to help put 1.5 million extra into the local economy. Now, we know this will slightly slow down, because C19 has had a massive impact on everyone, and it also has in philanthropy. We have incredibly good philanthropic partners, and also City of London. We have £1 million with City of London, which we're investing in the creative industry, specifically fusion skills. So by that we mean skills which are, some people call soft skills, but I don't think that really works, but skills in which young and older people can use and bring to any part of the creative industry, and actually outside of the creative industry. And that work is ongoing, working with schools, young people, colleges, universities, etc. And so for us, for the foundation, it's really important we continue to give those grants, and those grants are resilient. So whilst we have this kind of program of work, what we're also doing to make sure we have a real impact is listening to our potential grantees about what do they need, how long do you need it for, what works for you, what can we shift to make sure it makes sense to that community, the local school, etc. And also what we're doing is looking at the story behind what we do. And so when we talk about arts and culture, people kind of assume it's high art, it's exclusive, but actually East Bank is about inclusion. It's about all our partners providing inclusive exhibitions, work, buildings. So we're funding capital as well as revenue streams, looking, as I said, at grants through the Westfield Stratford City over the next 10 years. We have very lucky at the moment to be in a position of putting £10 million towards a 5-year programme of work, again, focusing on going through the doors of art, culture and placemaking. And as I said, co-designing, very important to co-design the grants so they make sense for local communities, and they also make sense and are connected to local borough agendas and strategies and concerns. So we have to be flexible. We know we need to bring more money in, and so actually having conversations, as I said, with philanthropists and socially minded businesses, and also thinking about how do we fund into the future. So there's been a conversation already around social investment, and I think that's something that we need to look at in partnership with other organisations. So really thinking in a wide kind of focus through different doors in which we can actually make sure that the Cultural Quarter is something which does deliver on the promises it made since it started. And so for us, it's to continue to fund and look at different ways in which we can do that. Now with C19, we know it's had a massive impact on people's ability to get jobs. They've lost a lot of jobs. We've talked about the Oxford research so far. We're looking at the loss of jobs of 110,000 or more in the creative industries. 27% of that is in London. I suspect quite a large amount of that is in East London. So we're looking at how do we design grants and bring in philanthropy that allows for those jobs to actually start again, for new opportunities to be there. So that's our main focus. But I must say that actually as a foundation with this responsibility to support and invest in an arts and cultural quarter for the next fit for the future and the next century, as well as this one, is that we are heavily focusing on diversity and inclusion. What we really need to make sure of is that when we're talking about C19, we are about building back better, but we're also talking about leaving no one behind. So that has to be the focus of any kind of investment, whether it's commercial or whether it's grant funding or philanthropy. So that's our main focus, bringing back better, doing it through the doors of art and culture, but also remembering that the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park is physically an amazing green space right in the middle of East Bank. And also we have these connecting blue and grey green spaces. So it's how can we liven those up to make sure that they're funded, and they are also providing, I guess, a new platform, new theatres to which people can actually meet each other and improve their well-being. So it's thinking outside the box about what we invest in and what we support.
Thanks, Maria. Good points. It's actually a question we'll come to later about funding leisure centres that might come back to what you were discussing. Sarah Wilkes, you're working, or operating at least, in the same part of the city on a very, very different thing. You're the team leader for infrastructure projects and formerly in charge of Borough Sill at TfL. What have you been seeing in terms of people's approach to infrastructure planning now? What are they able to do, and what could be done with Sill, or the Community Infrastructure Levy, I should say?
Hi, thanks Lisa, and hi everyone. Yeah, I have only just moved to Tower Hamlets relatively recently, I guess, so it feels a bit much perhaps to speak on their behalf, but I was previously at TfL as the Borough SIL lead, so happy to share some experience of my knowledge and etc. across London. So COVID has clearly had a significant impact on local authority resources, there's no doubt about it. And when we look at developer contributions, this relates obviously to the amount of development happening at that time, and SIL receipts, so the community infrastructure levy receipts have clearly dropped off for the most part across London. At this stage, though, it's hard to determine the actual impact on infrastructure spending itself. And I think at the moment, boroughs will probably also find themselves in different situations. 33 of the London authorities have adopted SIL and are charging that. And they have different approaches in terms of spending it. So some boroughs kind of spend all on an annual basis. Others have been accumulating SIL funds for some time and have quite big cumulative balances. There's some quite big differences in terms of governance and priorities. So some boroughs spending it perhaps all on one particular type of infrastructure and others spending it more broadly. And there's also a huge difference, of course, in London in terms of the actual SIL receipts that are being received. They tend to go up and down every year anyway, borough by borough. But if you compare, you know, in 1819, I think it was, kind of the highest SIL receipt in London was around about 43 million in one borough. And then you compare that to some of the ones on the other end, it was more like 700,000. So some quite significant differences in terms of the amount of funding coming in through SIL. And obviously, you know, boroughs don't necessarily have a great deal of control over the development itself coming forward. And it is dependent on that in terms of getting further SIL receipts. And I think there's probably always been some issues around SIL anyway. There's always been some difficulties, I think, some challenges. Obviously, the regulations came in 2010, but many London boroughs didn't adopt a SIL until around about 2015. And so, you know, and initially the SIL receipts are quite low, so it takes some time to kind of accumulate the balance up to something that you might be able to put towards a piece of infrastructure. And there's kind of been a few other issues around SIL, I guess spending. There's probably well-known criticisms of it in terms of, you know, unlike Section 106, it's not specifically set aside for a particular purpose. So it does tend to be a big pot of funding that any service area within the council can call on, I guess, which means balancing those different priorities can be extraordinarily difficult, particularly because across London, I think the RTPI came out the other day with a new report saying that the funding gap for infrastructure is around about 191 billion, which is an enormous funding gap, obviously, which SIL and Section 106 and developer contributions were never expected to fill. They would never fill that. There is this still significant gap in the funding. And there's also difficulties, I think, with SIL in terms of balancing out that, you know, that expectation that boroughs are spending SIL and they're actually delivering infrastructure as new developments happening versus perhaps particularly in areas of London where there's a huge amount of growth, you know, perhaps putting that money aside for a few years and saving towards a very big piece of infrastructure that might make a really big difference. And that's a very difficult balance. And obviously there's political pressure and other things going on too that might kind of influence those choices. So yeah, it is a difficult thing. And so I'm just checking my notes, but I think moving forward, probably, I think some other speakers have alluded to it, but really making sure that you're using the best, kind of putting the funding towards the best use. And in the case of SIL, being very, very clear on your priorities, which it might be, you know, when you go through the local plan process and you set out the infrastructure required and you look at your funding sources, you know, it might be that this is a significant change that people need to maybe look at some of their priorities and look at their governance and how it supports those decisions that they're making, and perhaps reflect on, yeah, whether things need to change at this point. It's an extraordinarily hard time to be making decisions. There was a lot of uncertainty at the beginning of the year, and obviously at the end of the year, there's even more now due to the pandemic and obviously imminent Brexit. So yeah, not easy, but certainly I think the boroughs being clear on their priorities would be a good start.
Thank you, Sarah. And I was seeing Peter nodding a bit earlier, talking about priorities. We'll come back to this in discussion, I think. Craig, I wanted to come to you because when we spoke, we talked about this question of waiting or not waiting. You were addressing planning reform. As you say, there's COVID happening now, but also Brexit and planning reform. What are you seeing in terms of decision making, and what are you guys advising in terms of what people should do in terms of funding or investing now?
Thanks, Lisa. Morning, everyone. A lot has been said about the importance of capital funding and new projects coming forward, but obviously key to the delivery of those projects will be the planning process. And as all of those who interface with local authorities will be aware, even pre-COVID, local authorities, planning departments were under extreme stress and pressure at that stage. And that has only got worse through the COVID process. All local authorities are doing a fantastic job to cope with it, with virtual committees, etc. But it has been hard work for everybody. So when we talk about resource and investment, from my perspective, it's equally, if not as important and more important, to invest strongly in the infrastructure, in the consenting process, as much as it is in the physical work, because ultimately every large-scale development will require a significant planning process to go through. We know things can be done quickly if everybody puts the resource and their mind to it. You know, the Olympics is a fine example of that. But that investment in resource within local authorities is extremely important. And that also needs to be put in the context of the planning for the future white paper, which inevitably was coming, but has been supercharged by COVID, which brings in some pretty fundamental changes to the planning process, not only in terms of the development plan, but also in terms of infrastructure levy and how local authorities can raise that and what they can spend the money on, etc. The issue, though, for now is, yes, the government has issued the white paper, very strong on rhetoric and very strong on the objectives of streamlining the process, which we'll all agree with, but there's very little detail in there. And depending on who you speak to, you know, this could be a process that takes anywhere between a year to 4 years before the full legislative framework, which he's talking to, beds in. And during that period, what do you do? What do you do as a local authority? Do you start to resource up to deal with the changes coming down the line? You know, the suggestion that every single local authority has a design director, by way of example. Where are you going to find all of these skill sets that aren't necessarily there in the form that are suggested in the white paper for all of the boroughs and all of the councils across the UK, sorry, all across England, let alone London? So that's a key resource, not just bums on seats, but financial and skill. The next issue is going to be, you know, as Sarah was saying, local authorities are getting to grips with SIL. Took 5 years from inception to them, some of them coming out, and some of them still haven't got that. If they're going to change the infrastructure levy process in accordance with the white paper, it's a fundamental change to what they've got at the moment. It will take some time to get to grips with. You know, the idea that it's actually levied on occupation, on the development value. How does that work? Again, I'm sure we'll get to grips with it, but any change takes time to understand and to filter through. You know, the suggestion that local authorities can borrow against that infrastructure levy seems very innovative. But again, how do you do that? How would that sit against council budgets going forward? And what if developers don't ultimately build out some of these schemes? How does that work? So I think there's a lot of challenges ahead for local authorities and developers to deploy this investment that we've been talking about. But from my perspective, really crucially to this is understanding the direction of travel that the central government wants local authorities and others to follow in the planning process. And if that is going to be 2, 3, 4 years away before it gets properly embedded, what do we do in the intervening period? Is it business as usual? Is it sit back and wait because fundamental change is coming? the views that Montague Evans have been expressing to their clients, both public sector, private sector developers, is crack on. You know, we can't wait for these changes. Yes, it is a direction of travel, but ultimately it's about progressing the investment that we all want to do and working our way around it rather than holding back and waiting for those changes to come in.
Thank you, Craig. All really good points. We actually were in a strategy session with Future of London yesterday, and David Luntz at OPDC and GLA pointed out that what's happening now is happening now. So to react knee-jerk to everything that's happening now, you know, it might not want to change all the designs everywhere, although we should be thinking about space standards and so forth. But Alice, I was going to come to you at Brent too. I mean, you've heard a lot of things, some suggestions. What have you been seeing, and what do you think of all this? Are there things that you can do going forward?
Yeah, sure. So I can only talk about Brent's perspective, but we have quite an ambitious, but certainly not reckless, an ambitious but sensible capital expenditure programme. So in 2014 to 15, we had a capital expenditure programme of 75 million. But 5 years later, 2019 to 2020, our capital expenditure programme for that year is 261 million. Now, by far and away, the majority of that is housing led. It's very important for Brent that we make our investment decisions on the back of the firm principle that is it going to improve services for residents, or it's going to generate income which saves us money. So for example, we have a wholly owned housing company called Invest Brent, or I4B, and they were lent over £100 million to purchase 300 units of private rented sector accommodation. So this is street properties really, but we're able to put 200 homeless families into these, and that has led to a revenue saving of £1.25 million. So we don't buy shopping centres, we don't do what Spelthorne has done, cost. You know, we invest in the borough to improve service to our residents or to make a saving. So our primary source of funding for the capital budget is the Public Works Loan Board, but with the rate rise, we did have to look at alternative means of funding, and we went out to look for a private placement investor partner, and we managed to secure £80 million of investment over 40 years, I believe, which can help fund some of our projects. So we've done that. We've tried to be innovative in looking for different sources of funding. We have relied a lot on the GLA for grants, or GLA and MHCLG for grants. So Good Growth Fund, Housing Zone Funding, Home Builders Capacity Fund, the Affordable Housing Grant for affordable housing starts. So it's really worrying to know about the financial position of the GLA. The Affordable Housing Prospectus is going to be published, I think, next week, and we've been hearing some very worrying things about a significant reduction in affordable housing grants for replacement properties. So that does worry us in the future. We've got a big SIL pot. We've got around 100 million in our SIL pot. A good 32 million of that, I think, has already been allocated to projects, but we've still got quite a lot to focus on strategic projects. So I just wanted to talk about a couple of the things that we are doing investment-wise. We've got Harlesden. Harlesden's a part of the borough, which is it's a really funky, how old am I to use a word like funky? It's where Pete lives.
Yes.
He lives in Harlesden, the funky part of Brent. Also quite deprived, although not his street, to be honest. We've got a Harlesden investment framework, which is a combination of capital, SIL grants. We've purchased an old cinema, actually, called the Picture Palace. It's a derelict. It was actually owned by Wetherspoons. It was never used as a pub, but it does amuse me that the council actually bought a Spoons. But what we've done, we bought it for just over £1 million. It was a steal, actually, and we are looking for an operator to convert that into a community-focused building, particularly focusing on the sort of BAME community activities that they want to be able to do there. That's one of the things we've been doing. Another one is we have an adult education centre called Brent Starts in Stonebridge, which again is a fairly deprived part of the borough, very badly hit by COVID. We're going to redevelop, it's a £45 million capital project, redevelop the adult education facility into a fantastic one, which provides a proper learning and teaching environment, but also 65 new council homes, which will be in there. So of that 45 million, 15 million of that is going to be from our SIL pots, because that's the adult education centre, which is infrastructure to support development, so that's all fine. The other thing that we've done as a council is that we've bought over 500 units, which are either on site or will be on site soon, from private developers in 3 blocks for affordable housing. So in South Kilburn, we bought from Telford and Notting Hill Genesis over 200 new homes. These homes, I tell you, they'd already ordered the white goods before we did the deal. So these are white goods for the private for sale units. So these new council homes have got cement bins. I mean, how fantastic is that? They're going to be so overjoyed when these tenants move out of the, quite frankly, really disgusting blocks that they're in at the moment into these new homes. So we brought those. We brought some off St George's in Northfields development in Appleton housing zone, and we've brought a key worker block off Quintain, where we're going to put key workers in at 65% of market rents. So that's what I mean about us using our investment decisions. In terms of COVID, I'm worried about the whole picture. I'm worried about development industry drying up, which reduces our CIL and Section 106 income. I'm worried about the GLA's financial position. I'm worried about the planning reforms because I simply don't believe what the rhetoric is saying about money for infrastructure being the same. And yeah, worried about TfL. We are really, really hoping that the West London Orbital, which hasn't yet been cancelled as a project, will still go ahead because that's quite transformational for us and Hounslow, the West London authorities, in terms of connectivity. And yeah, so that's where we are with that. So there we are. We'll keep going. It's sharpened our focus to invest in the right decisions, which will help our residents. Gemma, I think, mentioned about the inequalities. That's been absolutely stark in Brent, in some of our most deprived areas. So we'll just carry on what we're doing, but I think it is going to be a bit harder. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. All really good points, and thank you for kind of summing up a bit what we've heard. I've got you sort of sitting right next to Peter on my screen, so we've got a bit of a Borough thing going on. I wanted to make sure before we go on. So we've heard from all of you. We've got it's nice. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. I want to ask one that came up from, is it Damien, from Damien Wild, talking about how could you potentially fund leisure centers now, really suffering, many in need of refurbishment. It's a tough time anyway. I'm going to start maybe with Gemma, and then see if anyone else wants to come in. Maria, you were talking about that. Any thoughts about where to go for that kind of thing?
Like, I would say, actually, I'm probably not the best person to respond to the how to fund leisure centre piece, for a couple of reasons. So our investment is very focused around, first of all, looking at a social problem and then building the finance around that. Not saying that the leisure centre challenges does have social problems associated with it. So our type of funding could be part of the mix if it leveraged in others. But for the main part, I definitely think you would need to find something a bit more significant than perhaps a smaller impact investor could provide.
I wasn't actually asking you for money, Gemma, but it might have sounded that way. So,
yeah, but I guess I can only really respond from our perspective in that sense.
Exactly. Okay, cool. I was going to go to maybe councils, Maria or Peter. Alice, any thoughts about how to help leisure centres? Maria, if you can go off mute. Thanks.
I guess not so specifically on leisure centres, but I think the Foundation for Future London is looking at how we support buildings which provide some kind of service, whether that's sports, whether it's learning opportunities. So I think when you're trying to get funding in for a building, it's explaining what's happening inside that building and the impact it has socially and economically, especially to the community and the users in it. So the foundation looks at those kind of projects, and we would definitely consider what's happening, what's the social benefit, how does that become part of the kind of investment into the local economy. But it's actually quite difficult at the moment to fund the building in itself without getting capital philanthropic funding to the foundation for us to then give it out. But I would say to anyone that look at the human story behind the building as well as the building.
Thank you. Peter.
Well, I suppose the first order question is actually to look at your community assets, including leisure centres, and think through what scope you have for intensification of the developments, because I think that then opens up the door. So we have opportunities in Hounslow. We've got major leisure centres, we have community centres, but the idea would be to redevelop those for mixed use, and in particular housing. And I think it's then looking for the cross-subsidization of the leisure uses or the community uses through the housing development. So we are looking to intensify development and through that mechanism actually cross-subsidize the provision of community facilities.
Okay, thanks. I hope that went some way towards addressing that question. Lots of questions there, actually.
Lisa, do you mind if I just chip in? Because I just
go for it.
I just think what Beck said earlier is massively important here, which is that, you know, if you're creating these mixed-use communities, these kind of assets, I mean, a leisure centre has huge social impact, particularly with all the health outcomes, you know, Sir Michael Marmot, all the work that he's done. And so actually a lot of these large mixed use communities, you need things like leisure centres to create that sense of place, bring people together. So, you know, I think is absolutely, and if you put it in a mixed use environment, you can use things like housing to generate the revenue to cross subsidise the leisure centre redevelopment. So firstly, I think it is a massive social investment, and that's part of what Beck was saying about it all being a part of creating these communities. But secondly, kind of cross subsidising with things that generate more stable income and higher income, like housing, key worker accommodation, is a real potential solution.
Just
Thanks.
if I may, just to add to that generally, and Peter will be aware of this from the work we're doing with him in his borough at the moment. It's something that is not just an issue for local authorities. You know, for all the work we're doing for NHS Property Services at the moment, where they're trying to renew the health centre provision across London. You know, that is only really deliverable through cross subsidy, through the redevelopment and maximising the potential of those existing sites. So without going into specifics, Peter and I are in discussion about one in his borough at the moment, which is effectively going to be funded through a mixed use development, including north of 40 residential properties as part of it. So it is something that the industry, the public sector has been wrestling with for a while, and there are these solutions, but it does take time. And it's going to be interesting to see how, if there is any impact in the development market, what that might mean in terms of the cross-subsidy receipts that come out of it as well.
Good point. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just add very quickly as well, Lisa? Sorry, when I'm not misinterpreting the question around asking for some finance, I just want to say I actually couldn't agree more with what Maria and Pete were saying as well around the impact they can have for the sense of the community. It's really important.
It's a really good point. Thank you. Lots of good stuff happening in the chat as well. Not sure if you're following it, but there's been a discussion between Neil McDonald and Tony about local funding. Tony, interesting alternatives there for local projects. Can you expand a bit or explain a bit what you were discussing there?
Well, I have a nasty feeling that those I was involved with the chat with, I'm just adding something else now on congestion charging, road pricing, know more about this than me. But I think the issue that's been raised is, you know, that there is an enormous potential, particularly in London, which still has lots of small sites and neighbourhoods which need improvement, and individuals who need to be able to access finance, or individuals or groups of individuals to imagine developing, you know, or to lead the development of small numbers of housing within local areas. But the question of how to give them the access to the resources and the expertise that would allow that to happen is, I think, what we were discussing. But it's such an obvious thing to do because, you know, microfinance, or whatever one would call it, postmodern building societies, as I added in the chat, to empower people to kind of get control of the way developments are made, you know, is about 5 wins at once. That's, I think, why I think we were all enthusiastic about it. The question is how to do it and how to empower people to take on it's quite a big responsibility, but there are community organizations that can and are powerful enough to help people do it. So it's all about allowing people to get a bit of control over their own lives and how housing and other assets are built locally.
Thanks, Tony. Very good point there. I'm wondering too, there's a lot going on in terms of what's happening with investment. Beck brought up the point of investors, especially ones who are at a bit of a distance, like pension funds and so on, who just fund one asset class, needing an education. And Beck, I'll go to you, but anyone else speak up, Peter, perhaps anyone else, Alice, about what it takes to educate them. What do you do? How do you teach?
I think it takes a bit of time, which is a bit of a challenge. I think the other issue with it, I mean, there's kind of a range of financial issues around different returns profiles and how those kind of returns manifest themselves, which is, you know, a bit techy, but kind of takes some time to get through. I think the other challenge is just that leap to feeling like it was very low risk to now feeling like it's much higher risk. And that isn't going to be solved by staring at lots of spreadsheets. That's going to be solved by going to communities, seeing how assets are used and demonstrating how assets can pivot and how they can be, you know, used in different ways and generate the income that ultimately it's circular. We need to pay income to returns to pension funds ultimately so they can pay pensions. It's a circular world. So I think there's an element of sort of hard-nosed financial teaching piece and kind of more economics, but the element that will convince people about risk, I think, is getting out there and seeing it and seeing positive examples of where things have moved.
Thanks for that. Thank you, Beck. Does anyone want to add to that? Perhaps one of the two council reps. Actually, Maria, go for it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'd agree with Bex, but I'd also say that I think one of the important things, as well as looking at the sort of, I guess, commercial investment, is looking at actually roles that businesses have, pension companies, the building sector, and actually their philanthropic role, because sometimes their biggest investments that have a social impact is actually through philanthropy and grant making, as well as looking at profit. So the two things I think go together, and I think there's some really interesting work being done by foundations in the US and actually around the world. For example, Kosigi Foundation is looking at social investment, and they get investments from large-scale organizations and corporations in order to provide social investment grants to local communities, funding capital and building. So I think it's both things. It's this commercial ask and commercial investment, being very clear about what the impact of that, but I think the old style philanthropy is still really crucial. And of course, there's a discussion around philanthropy, but right now we still very much need it.
Absolutely, thank you. There was something that I discussed again with Beck, and I won't ask you to ask this, maybe someone else has a view on where the money comes from, because, you know, for the last year, couple of years, 5 years longer, there has been a wall of money coming in from sovereign funds, including from China. And of course, there's political issues with that now. But, you know, the question for all of you is, do you just stop if you're in a position to take that kind of money? Perhaps, again, this is a council level or investment piece, or do you issue caution? What are ways that you can look at taking money? How do you do that diligence? I'm going to go to Peter on this, and I have a follow-up question for you as well. How do you choose your partners and be aware of all that political?
Well, that's a difficult question for local authority. I suspect with great care is the answer, because we do get approached by a whole range of potential funders, and you know, and people know about this, and everyone else. But I think it's not a question about how do we choose our partners, it's actually how do we choose our investment needs. And part of that is going back to Beck's point. I think for us, it's trying to understand what is it that we want to invest in, the social value. What is social value? Do we really know what our communities want? We all make these assumptions that we know what our communities want, but do we really? So I think it's trying to understand very clearly what our communities want, translate that in terms of actually what does that mean in terms of developments, et cetera, what is the investment required? And I think then it's a question of actually engaging with the investors to see whether their aspirations match our own. And I think when there is a match, it happens. It happens. So it's not that we have a formula for selecting them, it matches or it doesn't. In many cases, it doesn't.
That makes sense, thanks. And you, the only other, I was going to ask you also, there was a question about boroughs may not have so much control over the development coming forward, and I don't think that's necessarily your view.
No, I don't believe that at all. So it all depends on actual, and we'll hear different perspectives from different locations about the role of planning and so on. I, for one, don't believe, and certainly it's not the approach we practice in Hounslow, in terms of we want to see proactive planning departments. And it all comes down to actually the planning department sharing the vision for regeneration and the growth of the borough. And I think if you can marry that with actually the market understanding that same vision, it leads for better conversations. And at the moment, we're not seeing any slowdown in terms of actually development proposals coming into the borough. And again, it's about clarity to the market in terms of what our aspirations are. And I think we've done a lot of work to be clear about that. But the aspirations are the aspirations which are shared and developed with the planners as well as more corporately. And I think from that point of view, we have a basis for actually better engagements, but actually better proposals. And I think that's what's happening. The proposals coming towards us now are very, very exciting because they're responding to our needs.
Thank you for that. Talking about that, and then points that Maria and others brought up, this idea that inclusion must be part of it and so on. I'm just minded of a conversation I had yesterday. There is a housing representation, a housing association not represented here today that is putting in a pitch to a council that has no social value and no diversity aspects to it at all. And I was shocked because I'm thinking, how on earth can you even get a look in with this kind of thing in these days? There is money at stake. These are projects that need to go ahead with partners, and to not include that, I think there's a point at which we just need to put our feet down and say, no, that's it. We're not even going to look at this one. So I just remember that and needed to say it. Sarah, I wanted to come to you. You made the point about the differences in SIL spend and behaviors and so on across the city. There are political implications. Should people be spending SIL now or not spending it? Can you say that?
I don't think I can speak for anyone else, of course. I think there'll be different reasons why people make the decision to spend or not to spend. Obviously, each borough is different, and there's a kind of complex set of circumstances behind that in terms of perhaps the amount of SIL money that they've accumulated, or perhaps the amount of development that they're seeing come forward, or whether they've seen development stop, or, there's lots of things that go on, I guess. At least in Tower Hamlets, I guess similar to Brent, is that this year we've committed to one of the, incredibly significant capital program. And that's not necessarily in direct response to what's happening at the moment. It's more a function of accumulating SIL receipts over a period of time, I guess, and building up the capacity to deliver projects. And it just happens to be at this point, I guess, that some of these things have come together. Similar to Brent, Tower Hamlets is experiencing a huge amount of growth. I think what Peter was saying also about being proactive and kind of, to a certain extent, we can't make development happen, but we can help enable it, and we can put things in place to kind of, ease that and to help things along. And things are still, I guess, happening in Tower Hamlets. And as I say, I don't think I can speak for anyone else. There are really wildly different situations across London in terms of the amount of funding that they're getting in. But yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. You brought up, and you mentioned when we spoke on the phone, this idea of collaboration. Someone in the chat was asking about, could we do more of this sort of rapid response cross-sector collaboration that we did in getting to COVID? I'm also minded of, Gemma, when they were talking about their funds, saying, the pace is just unsustainable for everybody doing this, public and private. The pace at which people were working in first lockdown, it would knock everybody flat. You can't keep doing that necessarily. But again, in response to this 2021 strategy piece, Future of London will look at cases of what went really well during these kind of collaborative times when we all moved very, very fast, and also what didn't. This question of, how did low traffic neighborhoods go so wrong when it's such a nominally good idea? Everybody's had a mixed experience, so we'll be looking at that as well. I'm going to maybe let people go a little early, but does anyone have a final comment that they want to make in terms of where to get funding? We're going to put all of the chat and the links that you've got, any further links from our speakers, onto the write-up for people to act on when they can, and we'll answer whatever questions we can. But any closing remarks?
Well, Lisa, I think, and the discussion about Section 106 is instructive, because there's no doubt that for London, assuming we get back to a fully functioning or nearly fully functioning economy again, the development does allow and does provide for all sorts of beneficial outcomes if it's well handled. I think one of the difficulties with and I'm not being critical of anybody in this, because I know why councils sort of store up Section 106, because they've got good long-term purposes for it. But I do think that, given that the way Section 106 is generated can often, and the places it happens, impact on the neighbourhoods where the developments take place, and then the money may not be used there and or for some time, I think that is a kind of challenge, because if people are going to be willing to accept development, and I think that London may have, under as poor Mr. Jenrick struggles with his algorithm. I think London and other cities may end up taking even more housing, which is not bad. In fact, it's good actually for London and the other cities. But against that backdrop, any Section 106 or SIL that is generated, I think ensuring people understand how the development leads to benefits, because it often doesn't have a label on it saying this was paid for by development, is most important. If people are to continue to assent to what are often very big developments, almost always in areas where more likely to be a deprived area with low-income households than rich people's areas, because rich people tend to live in conserved areas, so they protect themselves from all of that. So I just think that the link between development and its generation of resources and the way the money is used producing benefits kind of needs to be much more visible.
Very good point, ideally without points. Peter, did you want to bring something up? Peter and then Maria, short comments from each, and then we'll wrap it up. Go for it.
No, I agree with everything Tony said, but I think the only point I'd make is actually that when we say money's unspent, it's not the same as saying it's unallocated.
No.
And so by and large, what tends to happen is actually we allocate monies, and then it's always part of the pot. It's a contribution towards. And then it's really a question of how long it takes to get these schemes going, to draw down the money. The other point to make is actually, well, if you look at the funding pots available to local authorities, there are certain pots where you have time limits, and local authorities are always juggling. Well, actually, there's some pots you've got to use it or lose it. And so you will always prioritize those pots in favor of the pots that actually you can actually take greater timescales with. So I think by and large, we've allocated all our SIL, all our Section 106, but whether it's actually used becomes a completely different question.
Good point. Thank you. Maria.
Just to flag up that we have the Foundation for Future London has 2 grant programmes, City of London and the Westfield Stratford City. It's predominantly for the 4 boroughs in East Bank, but I would say to colleagues on this call to check out the website and see whether there's possible funding for your projects, or where you might be able to partner with us in providing funding towards people and places. And the second thing is, I'm going to be rather cheeky, we're looking for more philanthropists and more partners. So if there's anyone out there that wants to have a discussion with us, please do so.
Thanks, Maria. So offering money, asking for money, telling people how to find money, it's all about showing us the money today. Thanks very much to all of our speakers for their insight, for their practical suggestions. As I said, we will save the chat, so there's some great links in there. Thank you, Michael Payton, for a few of those, and to other people too for bringing up questions and comments. That'll all be shared. And again, we've heard that there is money out there. It's a question of finding it, educating the funders, prioritizing your decisions as local authorities, especially bundling and thinking about mixed use and the benefits that accrue. And then a few of you brought up the fact that inclusivity, social benefit have to run through everything. The lovely thing is now there's actually money for that. There's ESG funding. And even within, as Pete says, they don't do funds, but the mainstream funding looks for that. I'd like to thank you all. And we've been talking a bit about COVID, but Craig, thanks for reminding us that planning reform is coming through. And thanks also to Montague Evans for backing this session. There'll be more online. We encourage you to check that out at futureoflondon.org.uk coming up now. And again, if you're on Twitter, it's at Future of London and hashtag Learning from Crisis. We hope you have a good rest of the day. Get through to the weekend. It's coming soon. And we hope we can help you in future. Take care. Thanks, everyone, and goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
you.
Take care.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.